Morning. My name is Jose and I work at CIPR. And I basically have a few comments on the presentation by the representative of the IMF and about just the previous presentation. First, even though the IMF has provided the countries who have signed standby agreements with the possibility of increasing the fiscal deficits, those possibilities of increasing the deficit has come along with requirements of reducing spending in other areas. In addition to that, that flexibility has come along with the requirement of applying tight monetary policy. So the argument is, if you provide the economy with enough spending on the fiscal side, but cut down on the monetary side, then you're actually erasing the expansionary effect that fiscal policy has with tight monetary policy. So in the net effect, you're actually not being as counter-cyclical as you think you are. Then, in the case of, for example, Latvia, which was commented several times, the IMF has allowed Latvia to maintain a fixed foreign exchange rate on the argument that the Latvians are interested in maintaining the possibility of entering the Eurozone in just a few years. Maybe the IMF could have been a little bit stronger on that area, instead of allowing the Latvians to maintain the health of the Swedish banks, which is what seems to be happening now, as Latvia has maintained their peg. Of course, the European Union has participated in promoting Latvia's peg to a great extent, but I believe that the IMF could have had a stronger role in that area. And finally, yes, we have to think about whose friends we have in terms of avoiding the need to look for new friends. But I was thinking, how many countries, developing countries, actually see the IMF as their friend? Do they really think the IMF as a friend? Or do they obey the IMF or a set of mainstream ideas based on economic theories that have been proved at this time to be on very loose footing, at least up until the recent events that we have seen this year? Thank you very much.
Okay, on the notion that where you're acknowledging that in some cases we have allowed fiscal stimulus, but you're saying there are other conditions which may counteract that. One point general point I would make on conditionality, this is an area, I would say many areas where the fund has moved a lot and has drawn lessons from our experience in the Asian crisis, is to make conditionality much more focused, much more streamlined than it has been in the past. If you look at the recent, and I'm not talking about the last couple of months, you look at the programs over the last year or so, since we started scaling up the standby activity. And all these programs are on the web, you can look at the conditions. They're all very much focused on the financial sector, fiscal and monetary reforms that are needed to address the crisis. The old stereotypes of conditionality that they tried to fix every problem in the economy, whether they were central to the crisis or not, and there was some truth to that criticism. That is no longer what you see in programs. In low-income country programs, similarly, conditionality is now 3/4 of conditions in programs over the last year or so in low-income countries have been focused on public financial management, fiscal governance, transparency, auditing, issues which I think even many in the NGO community have argued are perfectly appropriate focuses for conditionality. On the specific question of monetary policy, again, it's horses for courses. It depends on the circumstances. In low-income countries, for example, in 2008, when the countries were being hit by the food and fuel shocks, which were inflationary shocks, and inflation in many countries shot up into double digits, our policy advice and the targets, in cases where we had programs with countries, the targets were adjusted to accommodate that shock and avoid turning that into a real monetary squeeze. We adjusted the inflation targets and we adjusted the monetary targets. In some of the emerging market program countries, you do face this dilemma, which is a dilemma that you face especially in countries with capital market access. You face this dilemma in any crisis situation. That on the one hand, you know, the counter-cyclical objective would argue for an easing of policy, but on the other hand, if you destabilize market confidence, you actually aggravate the instability, and you can end up with a counterproductive result. So it's a very fine balance to strike. We don't always strike it correctly, nobody can. But what we do try to do is adapt to the circumstances as we see the results unfolding. In Iceland, you know, initially the judgment was that interest rates had to go up sharply because of the risk of huge deposit outflows from the system. Since the program has been in place, confidence has come back and interest rates have been able to come down. And we're happy to see that happen as soon as it's possible. On the question of the Latvian strategic choice, I mean, you know, in a sense, we're damned if we do and we're damned if we don't. We're criticized for imposing policies on countries and riding roughshod over countries' own choices, which, you know, as a mission chief myself, I know is simply not the reality. But we can't also, at the same time, be accused of going along with countries' strategies when they're determined to do so and not fighting against it. In Latvia's case, the staff report on the Latvia program is on the web, you can look at it. That staff report did set out the pros and cons of the strategy that the Latvians were choosing to implement. And there are, you know, it is a judgment call in the end. There are advantages and disadvantages to the strategy that they've chosen, but in the end they were determined to pursue it, and you know, they're ready to do the policy actions. Is the IMF ever really a friend of countries? Well, obviously, it's hard to win popularity contests when your job is to go into countries that, you know, we only go in, at least in a program context, when countries are in very difficult circumstances, and policy decisions often are not pleasant. But as I think Doug was implying, you know, often the policy choices that they would make if we were not there, both with financing and with policy advice, often the policy choices they would make are worse. If you talk to African leaders, and I know more about this because, you know, it's more in my domain. You know, the fund and the president of Tanzania hosted a conference in Tanzania a couple of months ago to talk about the relations between IMF and African countries in particular, and how we could be helpful. It was planned before the crisis, and so it was taken over largely by a discussion of handling the crisis. But there was also some discussion about how the fund has changed, how the fund needs to change more to be helpful to Africa. But the end result of that conference was the African leaders saying explicitly and publicly that they did regard the fund as playing a very helpful role in Africa. They even, although they had their own representatives at the G20 summit that was coming up the following month, they asked the MD to advocate on their behalf based on the messages that he had given. So I think in many parts of the world, the fund is now becoming viewed as a positive ally.
Yeah, first of all, I want to try to clear up a little bit this difference on the numbers of agreements that are pro-cyclical. Okay, I said that the vast majority of agreements in the world, you know, have pro-cyclical policies. So I was including, as Jose does, pro-cyclical monetary policy. That is, if you're shrinking the real money supply during a recession, you're contributing to the decline of the economy. And so even if you allow for expansionary fiscal policy. So, you know, Hugh said 4 out of 14 policy, only 4 out of 14. 4 out of 18. No, I don't know which 18 you're talking about. I read off 9 just here that I've looked at personally that have they have pro-cyclical fiscal policy, and not including the monetary policy. And maybe we're counting them different. Like I'm looking at the original agreement. So if the IMF signs an agreement with Ukraine and says we want a balanced budget, and then that causes too much political heat there, and they, you know, they have to renegotiate that, and they have to allow it to 4%. I consider that to be pro-cyclical. In other words, you know, if we started off here in the recession, we had an external power telling the Obama administration that you couldn't have a budget deficit of more than 5% of GDP here, and then eventually we went to 13 like we have now. You know, then I would consider that a pro-cyclical agreement. And you know, you look at some of these too, like they're making huge mistakes in the agreement. So in their forecast, so Pakistan, they insisted on budget cuts. And by the way, in terms of the friend story, Pakistan did look for friends also before they went to the IMF. And so the IMF forced Pakistan to reduce their deficit. And what happened? First of all, they were wrong about the current account. They saw the current account as a big threat. The current account deficit has practically disappeared since the agreement was signed, and inflation is falling. So these are unnecessarily tight or restrictive policies. And this is what the IMF is famous for. I know it's true. There's a balance. It's a trade-off. You know, you can't always get it right. But I'm saying that you have a long track record now, 25 years of the ongoing, you know, just go back to the Asian crisis if you want 11 years, country after country where the IMF gets it wrong. And then they blame the country. I love that, okay? So, you know, this was all during the crisis in Argentina. I can't tell you how many times I was on the radio and people were defending the IMF and said, it's the Argentine government wants to keep the peg. And I would just say, okay, fine. You know, if Russia wants to renationalize all its industry, are you going to give them a $10 billion loan to help them do that? You cannot have it both ways. The IMF cannot, you know, fine, the critics can't have it both ways either, but the IMF can't have it both ways. They can't give these countries billions of dollars, sign off on an agreement, and then say, oh, that was just, they wanted to do it, those stupid people, you know, in the government. And, you know, that to me doesn't work. And especially when it's so obvious in Eastern Europe that the Western European banks that are in up to their neck on these bad loans want them to keep the peg so they won't default on these loans. It just kind of cries out at you that this is not something that's being done just because the masses in Latvia want to join the European Union in a few years, which isn't going to happen. So I really don't think that's true. And if you look at these agreements next time, maybe we can have another panel. We'll bring the whole stack of all the agreements, and we can look through them and see how many developing countries have pro-cyclical policies compared to the developed countries. You're telling me there's no double standard. You mentioned Greece, Italy, and Spain. Well, that's 3 out of all the developed countries in the world, okay, where the IMF might not recommend a stimulus. But then look at all the 50 countries where the IMF, you know, you want to say there's no difference between the program countries and non-program countries. Let's look at those 50 countries that are part of the program. How many have pro-cyclical fiscal, monetary, or other policy, or have to agree to give up their capital controls or other things that would help them in this crisis? Let's take a look at that. And I'm telling you, we've already looked at it. It's the vast majority.
Well, hopefully there can be a dialogue before another public event, because it is important. It really is important how many countries have a fiscal stimulus. I was looking at the numbers for Europe yesterday, and I mentioned to you, Hugh, that there was, like in Europe, the stimulus was 2% higher than in all of Eastern Europe. And yet, you know, you've also mentioned the fact that access to financial markets is very key in recovery, and a number of considerations to take into account. But I hope the two of you do get the numbers, agree on the numbers, because I think that would lead to a more constructive debate.
I want to respond to two quick things. First of all, the last comment that you made, I want to raise this. In the context of, you said, what would it be like if the U.S. government, at a time of a raging budget deficit, actually had to answer to an external force that said, no, you can't run 13% budget deficits? Well, welcome to the world of the 21st century, because the U.S. is the world's largest debtor, and there are those who hold the creditor side of that equation that are already starting to explain just how nervous they are. So it's not the fund, and it's not an individual country, although there are certain countries that are particularly integral to this discussion. But we are all going to be subject to the broader market forces, and it's not going to be the fund that's applying that pressure. It's simply the way that the financial markets have evolved. And again, the causes of that evolution, the imbalances, I'm not here to defend where those imbalances came from, because clearly I think even the IMF would agree that some of the prescriptions that the US in the 90s and the IMF itself were advocating didn't turn out quite as anticipated, and some of the imbalances that certainly fostered where we are today can be traced back in part to some of those policies. Having said that, we are where we are, and I think it's imperative that we look forward, not back. Second point I want to make is we've heard on several occasions now this allusion to the fact that the IMF funding is actually bailing out those terrible Western European banks, and that somehow that we could actually let those Western European banks fail, and that everything would be okay then, and the only people that would suffer would be the rich SOB bankers who would go home and suddenly find themselves poor instead of wealthy. The global financial system simply doesn't operate that way. So 2 points on this. First of all, the vast amount of the new funding going into the IMF under the NAB is not coming from the US. So the EU is, I'm not sure if it's 100 or 160. I've heard 100 to 160 billion. I don't know if that's it because it's euros or dollars. Whatever it is, Europe itself is contributing as much as the US. That's not including the additional funding that's coming from Japan, which is 100 billion, and others. So the idea that it is the US taxpayer that is somehow, on our taxpayers' backs, we are bailing out the Swedish banks is not entirely accurate. It's not even close to accurate. But the second point of this is, part of the IMF's role is to stabilize the global financial system as and when it gets into a very precarious point at which, in a world of bad options, the IMF, quote, bailing out those banks, and I don't believe that's an appropriate way to phrase it, but let's put it in the worst case scenario, is a better alternative than the alternative of not bailing them out. If Eastern Europeans were allowed to default, Austrian, Swedish, and other Western European banks were to suddenly find themselves insolvent, bankrupt, or worse, the impact on the European economy, Eastern and Western, and by extension the US economy and the global economy, would put us into depression. And there's no debate about what those numbers would look like, because they're all very ugly. So I think that there's a very real injustice that has crept into the system. And I am not one to defend the banking system. I was a banker. I don't defend it. I can defend what I did. I can't defend where the system evolved. But to say that what we should do as a result of some lousy actions and lousy decisions is to let it collapse is vindictive but not terribly smart in terms of what the global ramifications of that would be.
Well, I can't pass on my turn. Mark, there was the room brimmed with interest when you proposed that we get together and read 50 loan agreements together.
I'm busy that day. I'm sorry.
But on the other hand, it is really important. It's the kind of thing it's impossible to really talk about at a panel without being very specific. I'm legitimately interested to actually do it and to talk with you about what you're calculating. I think that is the right approach to say that there should be a presumption against these kind of policies. I wanted to respond to Doug's comments, though, which now take us completely afield from the IMF. We sort of left the zone of the IMF, which is fine, right? It is true that these are embedded in bigger picture questions. First of all, I don't believe it's the case that pressure from the Chinese or the markets on the United States has anything remotely close to the coercive power of the IMF on developing countries. It's not even close. But I think even more important is the idea that this is just how the markets are. The markets just aren't because they've been handed down from the heavens. The markets exist as a social creation. And if we don't like the rules of the markets, we can change the rules of the markets. This relates to the IMF in the area of capital controls, right? I don't think countries are automatically subjected to the markets just because they exist. They can opt in and out, they can do it in creative ways, in nuanced ways, and figure out how to buffer themselves to some considerable extent. And on the second part of it, also, again, the rules aren't just handed down from on high. The choice is not, by the way, $100 billion going from the US taxpayer, funneled through the IMF to the Eastern European countries to pay European banks. That is a bailout. It doesn't mean that the US is the only component of the bailout, but that's what's happening. There's an argument that, as you made, that maybe it's a good thing or it's a necessary thing, but it is what it is. There's nothing wrong with describing it for what it is and making a political judgment about whether the US taxpayer ought to be the ones doing that. Beyond that, there are alternatives to total default, and this is a mechanism that the world has looked at and sort of backed away from in terms of is there reciprocal obligation? Do you share the pain? Do the banks get away getting paid fully, or do they take some shared hit? When the U.S. nationalizes General Motors, there was a decision made that we're not going to pay the bondholders 100%. Right? The same kind of thing can be done. I think it would be, Mark referenced Simon Johnson. I think part of his idea is, he's certainly not being critical of the fund right now, but is saying, if we're going to look at the global financial crisis, one of the solutions to dealing with the improper power of finance and the big banks is to say they have to share some of the pain. And I think given that this is how the money is going to be funneled, part of the deal should be you don't get paid 100 cents on the dollar when it's being paid in the form of austerity in middle-income countries, worst hit by the poorest population, to pay back rich banks. So I mean, there are alternatives.
Just to show that I am strikingly nonpartisan, I agree with almost everything you said.
Well, I'm not
now that we've
partisan
established that.
Ideologically.
Yes, sir. Do you mind reaching forward?
Good morning. I'm from Brazil, and I find this discussion very interesting. And what surprises me in all this dialogue about reforms of the Bretton Woods is that many of the countries that are the most strongest critics of the bank and the IMF are now engaged in trying to reform these institutions. And if they do so, it's because they believe that they have a role to play. And I speak for Brazil, but Russia, China. But there's a risk in the discussion that I see here in the US that there's a tendency to believe that US Congress should dictate the direction reforms should follow. I mean, I'm reading your article, Mark. IMF shouldn't get the money without reform. We've seen throughout history, I mean, I can say for the World Bank, for instance, that many of the environmental reforms that were done in the bank's policies happened because of pressure by US Congress and holding contributions, and one might argue that the outcome was positive, but it ended up reinforcing the kind of governance that we want to change. So somehow I think the best way to promote reforms in those institutions is to give in power and not to try to ask Congress to determine what the executive director should say, and because then the discussion is no longer multilateral. So that's a risk that I see. I mean, and we've seen several times alliances between progressive forces in this country, and fiscal conservatives. And I hope that this will change so that we can really promote these governance reforms. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd just like to say that the conversation is somewhat U.S.-centric because we're in the U.S. and many of us here are trying to use the democratic process and open it up. And as Mark mentioned early on, you know, NPR gives a story and doesn't mention, you know, the IMF, which was the principal hang-up on the war supplemental. That's a problem with U.S. democracy. And we would like for other countries to be, and citizens in other countries, to be just as activist as in the United States, because, you know, we don't want U.S. imperialism in a multilateral institution. And it's absolutely great that the BRIC countries are planning to give significant collective input to the IMF reform and have that input prepared by 2011, because we need a multipolar, to pick a word, arrangement on the IMF board. And that's going to take some very significant shaking up to happen. And so we're counting on Brazil, among others. And at another point, it would be great to hear if you're playing a role in that. Robin Broad, you were the next speaker.
Thank you. This was fascinating. Hopefully will be fascinating dialogue to continue. I'm Robin Broad from American University. And I have a couple of points that hopefully will turn into a question by the time I get through with them. But first of all, maybe I'm always the odd duck, but I actually, Rob, really look forward to sitting here with IMF documents and going through them in detail. It's something I did for 2 years. I was an international economist at the Treasury Department, where I read World Bank and IMF documents. A man named Ronald Reagan was president, so I definitely don't want to go back to that period. But I, like some of you, many of you on the panel, have, every time Dominique Strauss-Kahn says something about the new IMF agreements, I go back and try and figure out the footnotes for what he says. And looking at the IMF agreements, I just don't see it bottom line. And so I really do think that's a key part of the debate. When I look at fiscal and monetary restraints, you find a couple of countries that you can hold up, like Mozambique, where you can say, okay, this is a kinder, gentler agreement, but by and large, I just don't see the change on the bottom line. So I really think that's something that the only way to resolve that is really with the transparent documents, putting them in piles, almost like a vote count here. So I think that has to happen in order to resolve that question. Secondly, second point, it is, my experience in Treasury Department also teaches me that you can use economic assumptions to prove anything you want. I was part of the team that put together the Baker Plan team. I was part of that, unfortunately. And we proved that in Treasury that the conditions attached to the Baker Plan, which was supposed to solve the debt crisis in the mid-'80s, that the conditions attached would lead to high economic growth rates in the top 24 top 24 debtor countries. It didn't happen because the assumptions were wrong. So the point there is that there is not just one economics, that you really have to take differently trained economists and put them around a table to analyze what kind of programs are necessary and not necessary. And I guess that's part of a question to Hugh, and it may not be fair because it may not be your domain in the IMF, but to what extent the IMF, now that it's hiring again, is hiring economists who come from more of a heterodox training and have come in with different assumptions around what kind of policies are needed and what aren't, so that there's actually a debate within the IMF, rather than just a debate between the IMF and outsiders. Because I actually think that's key, and it's not that the US Congress or one particular Congress should control that debate, but there has to be a debate, and to the extent it's not happening, I mean, it should happen in every country, and that's why this push to get parliamentary approval, not just in the US, but to have it required in every country, seems to me part of that. You want debate within the IMF, You also want debate in the so-called beneficiary countries, the recipient countries, and you want that somehow to be heard. And finally, I want to get back to a topic that Rob keeps raising that I would like to hear more about, and that is the current IMF position on capital controls. We've heard about the lessons from the Asian crisis in terms of streamlining conditionality. I think for those of us who are critics of the IMF, our bottom line criticism is not whether the conditionality is streamlined or not streamlined. It's what are the conditions. And it seems to me that one of the key lessons from 97 and 98 is that capital controls actually work. And so I wondered if we could hear more about where there are capital controls being encouraged in some of these IMF agreements. Thank you.
Since we're nearing our end time, I want to move to more questions to which the panelists can respond. Jeremy, and then Pat.
Jeremy Mark from the IMF. Rob was talking about the discussions on the Hill in recent months. Want a point of clarification and a question. At no time did the IMF go on the Hill and say, that was the old IMF, this is us now. That was old in any time context. So if it was repeated to you as the IMF as having said it on the Hill, it did not happen. Secondly, a question for you or Mark. A quote from Barney Frank, since you've been citing him. He was in Politico this week. And he was talking about the debate over the IMF, and he said, the left and the right in the US live in parallel universes. The right listens to talk radio, the left's on the internet, and they just reinforce one another. They have no sense of reality. I'd be real curious to know your response to that.
You should read the rest of the quote.
The rest of the quote was, I have now one ambition to retire before it becomes essential to tweet. I didn't think that was as relevant. My apologies. Yeah. You get the laugh on that, that's true. But the point is the core of the quote.
Hi, Gary Maberduke, retired Foreign Service officer who worked on debt crisis throughout the 80s and early 90s, and I guess that makes me an historical. So some of my information is dated, and I could talk about a lot of issues here. I do wanted to make one thing. Like Rob and I spent much of that time reading IMF reports, and hundreds of IMF reports, because it was more than 2 years. It was almost 12 years, a period of 12 years. And met with dozens of IMF teams. And I cannot think of a single occasion where I ever saw the IMF proposing cutting back in health spending or in educational spending. Not a single occasion. Having worked in Africa, I can also say that if you look at what happened in Africa in the 80s, particularly, the countries were essentially bankrupt. And whether they had an IMF program or not, the hospitals and schools that were built in the 70s under McNamara's programs at the World Bank and our programs with the AID basically fell into disrepair because there was simply no money to support them. We built up the infrastructure, and then we failed to provide the money to support it, and the local economies could not support it, which is one of the reasons you got the Washington Consensus about making countries much more financially stable and dealing with their own economic problems so you could make these other things work. Okay. My question now relating to the current situation, which I must admit I haven't followed the IMF issues very carefully, goes to what happened, though, back in the 70s in Africa. We're following the 73 debt crisis. The IMF and the World Bank and the US through the AID, pushed by the US in fact, all did considerable lending to Africa. And while there was conditionality on the programs, generally speaking, it was not enforced. The country would go off it, and we'd just get another program the next year. The result was the building up of huge debts not to the banks, as in Latin America, but huge debts to the IMF, to the World Bank, and to the US government and other donors. And the result was, by the time we got to the 80s, provoked in somewhat by the debt crisis in Mexico and then in the others, which were a very different phenomenon, people stopped lending to Africa. The debt was huge, and no reforms had taken place over the 10 years. And my contention is, and still is, I believe, was and still is, that the problem was you did not have the reforms, and you were not getting anywhere. And so the IMF's real failure was to lend money without asking for and getting appropriate and insisting on appropriate conditionality. I do think the IMF did make a mistake in thinking that way, and in also not really insisting on flexible exchange rates at the time. But that was partially also part of our problem of our whole profession at the time. So, in any event, my question is, are we getting into now, with lending to the IMF, with IMF lending to some countries where we're not, in fact, requiring structural adjustment, and maybe it isn't necessary in this case, are we getting into the problem that we're going to build up new debt, or replace bank debt with IMF debt, that these countries will eventually have trouble repaying? Sorry, ask the question.
Thank you. One last question before we come to the table. Any other papers? Oh, there's.
Hi, Tim Homan from Bloomberg News. I was just hoping for a little further explanation of the flexible credit line. The IMF, from what I can understand, has said that it's a program that's there for countries that have strong economic policies, but just sort of been a victim of the global economic crisis. Should we read into that after the global economic crisis is over, that the FCL will no longer exist? And I believe one of the panelists sort of also implied that there's sort of a quid pro quo, sort of a tit for tat going on with the FCL and its relation, the countries and their relation to the U.S. So I was hoping for a further explanation of what the criteria is for a country to have access to the FCL. And then just sort of the last question, curious to know what the panelists think about the next head of the IMF not being from a European country, considering the amount of influence that the BRIC countries are hoping to partake in.
Before I give the microphone over, we hear constantly over the years from people on all points of the political spectrum what the IMF's role is in particular sectors like health and education. And it should be very clear that the IMF does not and never has put sector-specific targets. The IMF never directly cuts health and education or any other sector budget. So what we're really talking about is a series of chain events where an IMF target that a country must meet in order to continue its access to official and private credit has an indirect effect. And an example of that is the country of Latvia, where we've talked about the pressure exerted within Latvia and externally to make cuts. And then, of course, we see in the news that the health minister of Latvia resigns because he or she refuses to carry out what are described as draconian cuts to the health sector. That is not as a result of direct IMF intervention. It can be construed as a result of indirect. So since that point of confusion arises so much, I wanted to clarify it, as well as just state that the goal, at least for many of us, is not to decide what the right technical answer is, economically or socially, but rather to ensure that sufficient policy space exists in the countries receiving IMF support to determine what the shape and the course of the adjustment, if the country is undergoing an adjustment, what the shape and course of that adjustment should be, and to make policy choices through democratic channels. So we've had about 3 questions. Who would like to respond?
Yeah, I just want to take the one about the Barney Frank comment. Because I've never been a subscriber to the postmodern theory of knowledge that, you know, reality is whatever people in the center think it is. And I like to look at track records, you know. Let's go to the late 90s, you know, where we started, the Center for Economic Policy Research began to publish papers showing arithmetically that the stock prices of the late 90s were not compatible with any plausible growth projections for the economy. In 2002, we began to publish papers showing that there was a huge housing bubble, and that the longer it grew, the more devastating would be its impact when it burst on the economy. The IMF has about 1,000 times our operating budget, and they missed both of those bubbles completely, in spite of the fact that it's their responsibility to publish the World Economic Outlook every 6 months and tell us what the big things are going on in the world economy. So I would say that if you look at track record, the left is very different from the right and from the center. You know, it was the left who said that the war in Iraq was going to be a disaster, not the neocons, okay? You can go through a whole list. And with respect to the IMF, I think we turned out to be right as well. If you look at what we were saying back in '98, when we stopped the IMF money on 3 votes in the House, and as a result you got the Meltzer Commission, which, a congressional commission, which actually complained vigorously about all the conditions that the IMF and the World Bank put on their loans, and that is the one reform that we've got in the last 11 years because of that congressional pressure. Which you mentioned. I think we turned out to be exactly right. We said that even though we were reformist, that's our goal, we're a reformist organization, all the organizations, all the ones that worked on it. We fought for reforms. We also said very clearly all along that change would take place primarily with the IMF losing this power, which most of the world sees as illegitimate, that is, its creditors' cartel power, its power to determine whether a borrowing country gets credit not only from the IMF, but from other multilaterals and from other governments. And we said that that is the main thing that would happen in the world, and that is exactly what happened over the last decade. The IMF lost most of its power in the world, and Treasury, of course, which is the principal overseer, also lost that power. And now they're trying to get it back. And they will get some of it back, but they won't get a lot of it, because you have the Asian Monetary Fund now. You have 6 or 7 Chinese swap arrangements with other countries. You have other institutions forming as well. You have the arrangements between Brazil and Argentina, so that the power of the IMF will not go back to what it was, and the power of Treasury to determine economic policy in 50 countries will not be what it was 10 years ago. That is how, primarily how progress is going to take place. And that is why we work in the Congress. It's not because we think that the United States should have this illegitimate power, which really just dates back to a colonial era. That's why the United States controls the IMF, because it was formed in 1944, and the power relations have not significantly changed. So, hopefully, the BRIC countries and other countries will at some point say, hey, we're not going to loan you this money unless we have some reforms, just like we're trying to get members of Congress to say. And, you know, it is possible, but more likely, change will take place because more and more alternatives will come up throughout the world, and just as happened in the last decade, it will go forward. Thank you.
Well, actually, Nancy, I counted a lot more than 3 questions, but I'll try to be very quick on as many as I can. First of all, I just wanted to address one point that Mark has made several times, which is this notion that the IMF has a track record of getting it wrong. And you know, I think that's a misreading of history. You won't be surprised I take that view. I think the important thing is, economic policy making, economic forecasting in particular, is a very inexact science. There's huge uncertainties involved, and with hindsight, you can always say that things could have been done better or could have been done differently, and we have acknowledged that in many cases. But the question is whether, when you look at the big picture, do the kinds of policies that we have typically supported end up delivering positive results or not? And even in Asia, where, again, with hindsight, there were things that you would have done, what we would have done differently, the results actually ended up being very positive, taking account of the fact that the crisis was always going to have an initial negative impact. The turnaround in these countries was extremely quick. Korea, for example, immediately they had 1 year of recession and then immediately got back to growth in the 8 to 10% range. In Africa, it took a long time to address the huge range of policy problems that they had. They did need debt relief in the end to unlock their potential. But when all the elements were in place, in the beginning around the late 90s, early in this decade, growth really started to take off in Africa. And part of the reason for that was that African policymakers themselves actually decided that these policies were the right ones for them, and they became committed to them. One correction on the NAB, if I may. This is not taxpayers bailing out anybody. The NAB and the other credit lines that the fund is getting from its shareholders are credit lines. Money is being lent with interest and money, and this money will be repaid. Typically, these are loans coming from central banks. There's the 100 billion credit line that the Treasury is giving, or the US is giving, is being scored in the budget as a 5 billion cost because on the notional probability of default. But frankly, the notion of default in the NAB is pretty far-fetched. Are we hiring a diversity of viewpoints in the fund? What we are trying to do is hire more what we call mid-career people. The fund typically, our intake comes from as PhD graduate, economics graduates coming out of university. What we are trying to do is bring in more mid-career people with real policy-making experience. And that hopefully will bring some diversity of view. But I can say that within the fund, issues are actually hotly debated. It's not as though we're monolithic in our views. Some of the issues are very contentious even within the building. Capital controls. There is no dogma on this. I mean, the Iceland program had capital controls initially. I think it may still have some element of capital control, although they've been trying to wind them down. We don't push them, but nor do we necessarily resist them. Our experience typically is that countries actually don't want them themselves because they are very afraid of the signal that it sends about their own the weakness of their own policies and institutions. I know that was the case in Turkey, where some commentators tried to advocate capital controls and the government dismissed the idea out of hand. Flexible credit line, quickly, will it exist after the crisis? Yeah, this is regarded as actually, in a sense, a crisis prevention instrument for countries rather than being primarily a crisis management instrument. So we would definitely envisage this as being a permanent feature of the support instruments that we can provide to the membership. The criteria for access are a strong track record of strong policies, but also institutions and policy-making frameworks that are robust enough to deal with any likely contingencies, shocks and global cycles and so on. Politics is absolutely nothing to do with it. You won't be surprised I would say that, but that is the reality. And finally, on health and education spending, far from fiscal programs certainly they don't directly squeeze health and education spending, as I think everybody is acknowledging. But nor, I would argue, do they indirectly squeeze them. And in fact, in most programs these days, including the recent standby arrangement cases that we've been discussing, there are typically now measures to not either preserve or even in some cases increase health and education or other priority spending. Some countries have priorities that go beyond health and education. And so quite often they'll define those priorities, and we actually even put floors in some cases on programs at their request to emphasize that priority. Thanks.
Thank you, Hugh. I'm afraid I need to be uneven-handed because we have just a few minutes remaining.
Well, let me just raise one area that hasn't been thoroughly explored. We obviously don't have a lot of time, which is shares and chairs, which is the governance issues that are sort of dangling out there. These are very complicated issues because they are very much beholden to a historical precedent. People don't like to give up something that they already have. But I think it's universally accepted that the U.S. has been actually pretty good about this, and that there is a structural issue that resides squarely in Europe, that Europe has a disproportionate influence that it is loath to give up. And when I say it, defining Europe as an it is always difficult because there are, depending on how you want to define Europe, at least 27 member states of the EU, and there's a lot of jockeying in those shares and chairs discussions. So the BRIC countries clearly, in today's environment, warrant a bigger say at the table. Everybody acknowledges that. How you get there is not as simple as the U.S. Treasury dictating it. In fact, I think the U.S. Treasury has been quite, I'm going to hesitate to use the word generous, but certainly open and responsive to the general idea, but it is highly complicated, and there are very many players involved in it.
Well, thanks for saving some time for me. There were a lot of questions. I want to go through a few. First, I just want to thank Heinrich Boell again and Sieper and the panelists, and especially Hugh for a thoughtful and serious conversation and balance. And I do hope that we can spend some time going over this stuff in the future. Then I just want to hit on a few things. Jeremy, to your direct question. Again, I hope I conveyed this properly. I did not say the IMF ever said this to me, but it was reported repeatedly, like more times than I can count. Very hard for me to believe it wasn't said. It was not said, not said the way you said it, not that anybody ever said that's the old IMF and this is the new IMF, like we disavow our history. But specifically that you are presenting us evidence about loans that no longer reflect our change in policy. I can't imagine why that seems controversial to you, since Hugh said it, the IMF says it all over the website.
The way you presented it in your opening remarks about April versus February.
That's exactly, that is precise.
But it never happened. It never happened. So if you don't repeat it.
No, it did happen. What did happen was that I was told that repeatedly from multiple sources on the Hill. So that is, in fact, what did happen in my personal, direct experience. Whether you said it or someone in the IMF said it, I can't say that, and I hope I didn't convey that I had first-hand knowledge of that. I find it reasonable to assume that that impression was conveyed, since it came indirectly to me repeatedly, since in fact the IMF does say repeatedly that it is changing what it's doing, and in fact unarguably has changed in some ways, not all of which are bad, like the FCL, right? Or if you look at the step, streamline conditionality website. Often in the past, the IMF had included conditions that were felt desirable, but were not necessarily directed. We're not doing that anymore, says Strauss-Kahn. IMF to launch new facility. IMF revamps its lending. I mean, this is the line from the IMF. Of course this is what's being conveyed.
But this is not what the way you presented it in your opening remarks as a statement.
Okay, well I think my opening remarks are actually compatible with what's on your website, and you've conveyed your view and I've conveyed my view, that I'm reporting what was said to me. On the Barney Frank quote, I think what was unfortunate was that I think Mr. Frank has a close relationship with the managing director and believes in his commitment to reform. I think that Mr. Frank shares a lot of the criticisms that many of us have laid out, that he's articulated himself these criticisms in great detail in the past. He believes that there is and will be change at the IMF, and I hope he's right. I'm a bit more skeptical, but I want to be proven wrong. That's my comment on that. And he was in the middle of a tough vote, and he was frustrated. I wish he was more frustrated. I wish he was more. On the flexible credit line, there's about 9 separate conditions that are laid out for who qualifies for the flexible credit line. You have to basically have undergone structural adjustment already to qualify for the flexible credit line. So the concept of it is good, but the conditionality is not so absent because, in fact, you had to basically already do conditionality to become eligible for it. It's pretty clear the United States would not qualify for the flexible credit line if you look through the 9 conditions. On the question about the new debt crisis, I think that's a very acute and important question. There aren't good alternatives for some countries. I think for the poorest countries, there needs to be really just an abandonment of loans, particularly now in the crisis when they're already suffering huge balance of payments problems and are going to for the foreseeable future. I don't think nearly enough is being done with the gold sales deal. There should be 100% loans, and it should be not increased not increased grant component, but just full-fledged grants. On the issue of capital controls, I think that Hugh just described as both the IMF position and the reality correctly. There was something in the IMF document, one of the documents put out in connection with the Tanzania meeting, which was not like we will always go to the mat and oppose capital controls, but it says we frown on them, we think they're basically a bad idea, especially for the poorest countries. I think that view, which I'm sure is an authentic view, contributes to the idea that to adopt capital controls would signal that you're in trouble. I think also there's an understanding that you don't want to, that the best time to adopt capital, you may need to adopt capital controls in crisis, but the best time to do it is not in the middle of crisis, to do it in times when things are relatively going well, so you avoid this harmful signaling effect. And I think there's just a lot more. We've lost historic knowledge about ways to do capital controls effectively, and I think there needs to be a lot more attention to that and a lot more experimentation on that. There's a lot to be said about the health and education spending issue, but I'm sort of going over my time on this. I think Nancy conveyed it right, that it is the case that it's just very hard for the health ministries, education ministries to maintain the budget line if the overall budget is being crunched hard. It is the case that the IMF is leaving aside some stuff now for social sector spending, although part of that is, the way it's justified is by targeting it more. So you're reducing sort of universal subsidies and programs and protecting the ones that are purportedly targeted to the poor. That may be a decision you have to take in a really horrible time, but there's a lot of reasons to be worried about whether that's a sustainable approach and whether in fact you're actually excluding people who should be covered by it. And then just finally I wanted to reiterate again to go back to the U.S. focus here on the Congress and what was being asked, and to say I think these are just good policies that I hope the IMF is going to move towards, whether it's through U.S. pressure or just on its own. I think an explicit presumption against contractionary policies in a contractionary time is appropriate, and a requirement for an evidence-based rationale for why not to do it is appropriate. I think looking for parliamentary approval for policies would do everything good and nothing bad. I think doing these ex-ante poverty studies would be very helpful, and I think some more explicit policies around health and education, much more than the incremental stuff we're seeing now, is called for and would make the world a better place.
Well, I think you'll agree that we have had an outstanding panel. Let's give them a round of applause. Specifically to acknowledge the organizers of this event, Dan Beaton from CEPR and Leanna Shalatek from the Boell Foundation. And I wish that there were 2 people that could have the last word in the debate, and then I'd call on you, Jeremy. But we're going to have to adjourn for now, and I do think that the specific call for agreeing on some specific data, not only around the fiscal targets and the monetary targets, but also around the health and education spending record of the IMF would really advance progress in our next public dialogue. So thanks to all of you for coming. I hope to see you again soon.